I'd love to very briefly introduce our panel. We're so lucky to have all four of you here today. So Marlene and Pia came to talk to me, was it a year ago, and said, we're doing fascinating stuff and we need to be talking about this, we need access to your students. And I said, yes, that's exactly what you have to do.
We didn't want money, we just wanted people.
Because wait till you hear what they're doing, and that's what the whole thing is today. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction, which is that Dr. Goldman is a professor in the Department of English at U of T, and she specializes in contemporary Canadian literature, and I think hot off the press is her new book, or in process?
In press, yeah.
In press?
Indexing.
Which is, the book's got a great title, Forgotten. Is that the
Yeah.
Forgotten? Age-related Dementia and Alzheimer's in Canadian Literature. And she's also written other books, Paths to Desire, Rewriting the Apocalypse, and Dispossession are some of her earlier works. And then Pia's up next. So Pia is a senior scientist at the Toronto Rehab Institute and also at Baycrest Health Sciences, and she's also an associate professor at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health. And she does really interesting research on all of this sort of intersection of all kinds of things, which we'll hear more of. You can see I'm giving a short version. And then, where are you? Where are you, Julie?
Do you want me to just bump things? Yeah.
So Julia, I first heard of because she's a playwright and newly minted doctoral graduate, right? So her PhD. So Dr. Julia, right, has been for 15 years in professional theater and done a variety of different plays. But the one I'd heard about, which we're going to hear more of today, was Cracked. So we're going to hear a lot more of that. And then Professor Stephen Katz from Trent is a longtime fan, not fan, hopefully fan, but partner and colleague here at the Institute, and has been doing work with us for years and years and years, and has also done some of these previous presentations for us. So I will let you talk about all the cool things you guys are doing. Great.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. Thanks for coming. The purpose of the seminar, as the advertisement promoted, is to introduce and hopefully expand a research group in Toronto that so far we're calling ourselves the Toronto Age Studies Collaborative Research Group, which is a mouthful that may get edited down in the future to something,
Well, we like to call ourselves TASK.
memorable, but it adds up to TASK. And we'll talk about our work in the first hour of the seminar. In the second hour of the seminar, we'd like to engage in conversation with you about your own ideas, career thoughts, or ways of thinking that might involve critical or interdisciplinary or provocative directions of your own in age studies. The introductions have already been made, but I would like to thank Susan and Esme for their hospitality, for giving us this time. Now, all indices. We're from a series of backgrounds that prefer models that also incorporate other things, that oppose separating subjective and objective dimensions of aging, or mind and bodily dimensions of aging, or self and other dimensions of aging. And all of us, I think, in different ways, as we'll hear, have in our careers been influenced by the intellectual winds of change that blew through and transformed traditional disciplines since the 1960s. In some form, academic fields have seen the influences of Marxism, phenomenology, feminism, deconstruction, postmodernism, discourse analysis, narrative analysis, the sociology of the body, social studies of science and technology, queer, lesbian, and disability studies, etc. And most recently, age studies. That's really where my background is, which is I've looked at some of these winds of change, these theoretical influences in other streams and disciplines, and see where they might impact and influence the study of aging and old age. And we've been drawn particularly to apply some of these developments to the aging field by discovering along the way that the imposing disciplines and figures of geriatrics and gerontology are maybe not the only ones who have something to say about aging. I should say that other research groups like this one have been forming. Some of us are members of these as well, such as the European Network on Aging Studies, or ENIS, the North American Network on Aging Studies, or NANIS, and earlier Marlene Goldman began and initiated a group called the Working Group on Aging, Memory, and Aesthetics with Andrea Charisse, which was a tremendous, I think, tremendously exciting group that ended up with lots of meetings and workshops on readings and a conference as well. I'm also a member and I guess an architect in some ways of the new Trent University Center for Aging and Society, which is also partnered with the Gilbrea Center for Studies in Aging at McMaster University. So there's a kind of movement happening abroad and within that's interested in age and interested in aging and old age, that's intersects with, that's within, but also apart from traditional disciplines of geriatrics and gerontology as well. I want to very briefly talk about my own work and how they relate to this group before turning it over to my colleagues. I like to think of my work as critical gerontology or critical thinking in aging studies, inspired by critical theory, which is a mode of inquiry stemming from mid-20th century, the mid-20th century Frankfurt School in Germany, and its leaders Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, who believed that research, however it was radically thought about, involves our reflections on our assumptions, on our principles and context, that we have to reflect on the concepts and models we use. And also that ideas are forms of practice. Ideas just don't say things, they do things. They have effects, they work in environments and spaces. And further, in the words of Michel Foucault, this kind of reflective work involves what he calls a critical curiosity, which he says is a readiness to throw off familiar ways of thought and look at the same things in a different way, which I think is a nice way of summing up the critical attitude that I like to adapt. Critical thinking in aging studies also involves interdisciplinarity, because aging is a diverse process, of course. It requires interdisciplinary approaches. It inspires plural knowledges. It engages in shared expertise. And in fact, as Andy Achenbaum, a historian of gerontology, has written, the early works of gerontology were very interdisciplinary. Eli Metchnikoff, who invented the word and term gerontology, wrote books in the early 20th century that has poetry in it, that has religion, that has philosophy, that looks at texts and literary sources in order to understand aging. So the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences, in a way, were interdisciplinarily linked at the birth of gerontological age studies, but since then have been rather siloed and split up, which is something our group wishes to address in our work. The other thing that a critical attitude, I think, in aging for me has involved, which is getting inside aging. That is the subjective dimension of aging. The sciences may explain life, but it takes, I think, the humanities to reconcile ourselves to that life, to find meaning in that life. And that requires also qualitative research in the social sciences. So critical investigators are interested in what it means and feels like to grow old. And their research, therefore, looks at the inside of aging to inspire us and give us voice, also about alternative stories, suppressed stories that contest our dominant cultural narratives of aging. So interdisciplinarity, getting at the inside of aging. Two other quick ideas. James Barron and Vern Bankston introduced their very important 1988 text called Emergent Theories of Aging. Here was one of the first gerontology books that just looked at theory in aging. And on the first couple of pages, they said gerontology was data rich but theory poor. In the same text, Harry Moody said that we have a paucity of theory in gerontology. It's an embarrassment, he said, to students of gerontology that we have this paucity of theory. And these phrases have been continually cited by critical gerontologists who wish to look at theory, to get outside of this paucity, to inspire new thought spaces about aging. And we've had many exceptional scholars today who have done exactly that. And finally, I like to think of ideas kind of as my friends, if I could say that. I know those of you writing PhD theses and MA theses probably see theory and ideas not as your friends, possibly at this point. But they sort of become your friends. They grow on you because while ideas seem confined to books and conceptual frameworks, critical thinking also looks at their historical relationship. And there's many wonderful examples, I think, of how ideas started to move and grow and circulate and influence and become the basis or the plank of building larger kinds of formations. I think of George Simmel, who helped invent urban sociology, partly because he lived at the center of Berlin in the early 20th century, which was the largest city in Europe at the time, and lived right in a space where he can make observations about urban life, and wrote The Metropolis and Mental Life in 1903, which is still one of the best, I think, essays on living in modernity, a kind of psychology for modernity. But he lived in that space. His ideas flowed between he and that space, and his mind absorbed, in other words, the life of ideas and not just the thinking about it. And my final word is that I want to remark on the fact that critical thinking involves reflexivity. John Hendricks wrote a great line when he said, "If we cannot see ourselves in our explanations, perhaps we should pause before offering this explanation to others." And his message is we should include ourselves rather than hide ourselves in what we study and write about. In fact, Ignatius Nasher, who wrote the first book on geriatrics, is considered the father of geriatrics. 1914, got his first inspiration by visiting a slum workhouse in 1900. He heard an older woman complaining of pain. She was being ignored by the staff, and when she reached out to touch him for attention, the attending doctor told Nasher that, "Leave her alone, it's just old age." And at that point, literally touched by this woman, Nasher says, and he says, and I quote, he realized that it's not just old age. That experience, that touch, led him to imagine a new field. And that's what was needed eventually to inspire him to invent geriatrics. So just one touch. I think that's a Johnny Mathis song, isn't it? Anyway, you have to look that up. That'd be a great story of Nasher, just one touch, wouldn't it? Story of Ignatius L. Nasher. So I'll stop here and move on to Marlene.
I opened someone else. The view. Yeah. Okay, great. So I took a somewhat unusual route to become an age studies specialist. In fact, it's probably Stephen Katz's fault. I did a book on haunting and possession. I got very interested in hysteria studies, in literary studies, and focusing on Canadian literature, and that became a book, Dispossession, Haunting in Canadian Literature. And I realized that the hysteria diagnosis was born at the same time as, and in the same space as the Alzheimer, and both of them a team of clinicians and neurologists and began to research in earnest. I realized though, and I have a lovely friend who's an editor, and she said this interest that you're studying is in other people's fields, and it's almost like a wheel without an axle. So what's the literary angle? And so I realized that my contribution to the study of dementia would be a recognition that historically people with dementia were kind of narrated within the framework of the elegy, that this was a regrettable but natural and somewhat expected part of aging, And there was a shift roughly in the 1970s in North America primarily that translated an elegiac story, this was part and parcel of our mortal being. And that shift occurred because then it became a monstrous alien disease. And that model was really disseminated by researchers and scientists. And my reading, and hopefully you'll read my book at some point when it comes out, suggests that it was politically motivated rather than scientifically motivated. So I really am a strong advocate for looking through historical frameworks to see alternative stories. Not necessarily that we're going to find a story we like better, but look at always things as a kind of contested discourse rather than a truth. So I was really fascinated by a kind of intergenerational approach, and one that really didn't horrify or separate the generations. So we're now in a situation, I don't have to remind you, we talk about people with dementia as a kind of tsunami that we're facing as a society. It's at the kind of rhetorical tropes associated with ghosts, monsters, and zombies. And so we have images of people with dementia within that framework. The other framework that struck me and other researchers, such as Peter Whitehouse, as kind of strange and anomalous is a Marshall framework, which is we're at war with dementia. And so again, I'm really struck by the difference between what Alwa Alzheimer proposed and our current constellation of metaphors. So what I realized was, and this is a big summary, but in different historical periods, in different cultures, brain aging was often viewed as a natural part of the life course, and it didn't inspire fear or dread or large sums of research money. So, thanks to contacts with medical anthropologists, I was able to realize that there have been in-depth studies in India and Japan, and now increasingly Native North American peoples, and none of these cultures rely on our fundamental disease model, and nor do they frame dementia as a horror story. So equally fascinating, and I show the slide of Alzheimer because when I looked very carefully at the research documents, I became an archivist. When Alzheimer first began to research age-related dementia in Germany in the late 19th century, this was an irony that is, to me, astounding. He never thought he had discovered a disease. He emphatically, and he and his coterie, insisted that what they were seeing in patients were early signs of aging. So unfortunate but very common features that were just manifesting earlier in the life course. So again, politics intrudes. So Alzheimer died quite young. His employer, Emil Kraepelin, was determined for politics and financial reasons to prove that his lab was moving ahead of other labs. He was in a lab contest. And also he was really unhappy with Freud's kind of claiming of territory. So he was emphatic in introducing a new disease in the 8th edition of his textbook, Alzheimer's disease. But there was, and you look back in the archives, tremendous opposition to naming this a disease. And medical historians say the reasons he did this, because he was a really good scientist, are still a mystery. So several authoritative and very famous studies have demonstrated that there is a blurred line between normal cognition, mild impairment, and full-on dementia, a declining straight line. So I'm not going to get into the details, but I've got sort of images of diseases, bacteria and virus, and none of these kinds of images accounts for dementia, which is multifactorial, right? So one of the most paradoxical elements that early and recent research into Alzheimer's disease has shown irrefutably is a large number of people with so-called Alzheimer neuropathology in their brain never become demented in old age. And this finding, if this is the biomarker, like a tubercular disease or some kind of bacteria like botulism, if you're saying this is a biomarker, then it should appear and be causally related to the illness or the symptoms, and it's just not. So again, we've got something that has been labeled by the media as very simplistic, and what I've kind of developed as a kind of conceptual understanding is that, literature and accounts of brain aging really help us understand that we're not looking at a single reductive germ. We're looking at a kind of cumulative set of traumas, and one way to think about it is our minds and bodies keep the score. So unlike a virus or a bacteria, dementia springs from a host of causes. And yet I found it interesting, and I looked at a number of discourses. I looked at literary discourses, I looked at research, clinical discourses, bench scientists. But when the media kind of conveys, what we're grappling with, it's very often presented as if, oh, I've got Alzheimer's or old-timers or whatever. So my sense is, and this again is a shorthand, but what was really good for fundraising, undoubtedly good for fundraising and draw attention to problems besetting older individuals, is actually very bad science, and it's quite misleading. And so one question would be, what does it matter if we call something a virus or a bacteria or a disease, since the impact and the effects, cognitive decline is real, other symptoms associated with brain aging are real. So, this is where we step into our research. I had the experience of being with my mom, who was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. And this is a really blurry upstream diagnosis. And I guess I just want you to think about what happens if you're an older person and you visit your doctor because you notice you're becoming increasingly, your short-term memory, immediate memory is decaying. And if it's found that there's no underlying psychological or physical explanation, and there are empirical tests that reveal evidence of cognitive decline, your doctor might tell you got this disease. And so that's one route, and that's kind of the route that my mom went down. In another scenario, there's a physician, Peter Whitehouse, that says, you know what, I've noticed that telling people they have a disease actually makes them sick, emotionally, produces a great deal of anxiety. They start to forecast into the future, ruminate about what will happen. So he's kind of opted not to say that. He'll offer this kind of story, which is, this is a natural part of the life course. This is brain aging. We don't know how fast, the symptoms will develop. And at Trent, there were studies done kind of following what happens if people are told that they have a disease, mild cognitive impairment. And from what I understand, people like Kevin Peters, who is a head of researcher, people get really sick from the label, like profoundly sick. And by that I mean depressed. So the first option, offering a story that this is a disease, is both, I'm getting polemical and I realize it's inaccurate and it's bad medicine. So I ask in my text, what are we doing? So we're offering models that actually exacerbate negative incomes. And this isn't true for everyone. Some people, benefit for all sorts of reasons from being told they have a disease. But for a great deal of people, it comes with negative outcomes. And these outcomes aren't part of the primary symptomology. It's not part of the problem associated with memory loss. It's instigated by stigma. And I've got some kind of slides going, and you're wondering, why are we talking about lack of sleep, lack of education? Well, I said earlier that one of the things I realized through sifting through empirical studies is our body keeps the score. We don't get a disease late in life. And so a number of really interesting epidemiologists are asking us to reframe our understanding of dementia and see it as a kind of, I think it's like hits over the lifetime. Like, my kid plays soccer and I'm conscious, and my other kid plays hockey. I'm conscious how many hits they take to their brain, because over time, you think of Muhammad Ali, you know that these hits to the brain are going to potentially have negative outcomes, neurological illnesses. But what we're now realizing is the hits can include lack of education, poor nutrition, also depression. These are correlated with, and there's a host of other factors. So Carolyn Brain is a prof at Cambridge and a researcher at Cambridge, and she's really mobilizing, like, let's not think about eating blueberries in our 70s. Let's think of ensuring that people have access to good education so they'll have neural reserve, and also second languages, active use of second language, and making sure people don't have hearing loss and so they're not socially isolated. These things are kind of, I'm sure there's fancy words, but over a lifetime, we can look after our social and neurological health. So when I discovered the politics that was driving science and the iatrogenic impact of the disease label, I was really interested in what other ways of telling the story are available. And I also felt, so their lack of education, depression, head injury. So yeah, our bodies and minds keep the score. And we get labeled with dementia and assume it's a disease, but it's been accumulating throughout our life based on, I think, unlucky chances, some of them political and sociological. So I shifted, and this is a little strange for me even to say, I shifted away from a book. At the end of this project, it's probably about 8 years to write and research this thing, and I finished the book and I got profoundly sad, and I realized the people who had been stakeholders, including my mom and people who are aging and suffering from memory loss, wouldn't be able to access this book. So I became a filmmaker, and I asked Alice Munro, which was one of the stories that I read. It was absolutely a radically person-centered approach to dementia that she wrote in later life. So it's it's called In Sight of the Lake. It's from her recent collection. And so I went, because I'm a Canadianist and I have contacts with her, I asked her if I could make a short film, so I did. And I'm just in post-production. And I am going to leave the page for a while. So I'm trying to make person-centered, provocative films that can be accessed by caregivers, people with dementia, and the public, because writing in this ivory tower way has made me sad. So I just approached Margaret Atwood and received the rights to film a very, very powerful story that she wrote in her latest collection called Torching the Dusties. And so I'm soliciting people. I even asked Stephen if he'd read the story. I'm trying to make this research and a creative project. So I'll send a PDF of the story if people are interested. And unfortunately, I can't stay for talk back because I have to teach in Scarborough, but I've put a website with information about the film that I'm currently making, so you can see images from that. And also write to me. I'd like to know about your projects, and if you're interested in helping me research this next film. It's dystopian, very apocalyptic, and I'm afraid to make it, so I need some help. Okay, so on that note, thank you so much, and I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
Thank you. So Marlene, when do you need to leave?
I'll be leaving at 1 because I have to get to Scarborough.
So we'll take a little stop at 1, and we have memorial mugs that you can take with you and stuff. But also, I know some people are here just for the hour,
Yeah.
and then we'll open it up to students subsequently. So we'll do a little stop. At
So now we have Pia Kontos. We'll talk about her connection to this group.
Great, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here to participate in the seminar that introduces the Toronto Age Studies Collaborative Research Group and our respective areas of research and teaching. I've included some about my teaching as well. So my research program represents a convergence of a number of different themes, including embodied and embodied practices, innovations in dementia care that support embodied self-expression, and knowledge translation. And in all of these areas, I incorporate ideas from the social and health sciences, the humanities, and the arts. And as Stephen talked about, the importance of interdisciplinarity, for me, it's really been a key intellectual resource in my work. And so I'll describe each of these areas and conclude with a brief description of some current graduate teaching that I'm doing. Social theorists, in their efforts to capture the complex nature of the body, have drawn upon numerous disciplines, such as feminism and humanities, to challenge dualist approaches and address the politics of the production and reproduction of the body. However, rare in this literature is serious consideration of the pre-objective, primordial relationship we have to our bodies and the world, and an exploration of the interrelationship between the primordial body, culture, and social and historical contexts. So I was very interested in developing an integrated theoretical approach to the body that respects the sociocultural environment and its influences without rendering peripheral the existential immediacy of the body. And so this led to my proposed theoretical integration of Merleau-Ponty's reconceptualization of perception and Pierre Bourdieu's notion of habitus. And it culminated in a perspective that I've termed embodied selfhood. Now, I don't have the time to explicate the theoretical bearings of embodied selfhood, but certainly can distill for you quickly the essence of the argument that I advance with this rethinking of selfhood. So really key to this is that separate and apart from cognition, we all have pre-reflective intentionality that gives our bodies a generative, creative capacity to understand and the sociocultural dispositions to engage with the world. And so this is really in stark contrast to Cartesianism, which suggests a fundamental passivity of the body, since it's primarily cognition that's held to be essential to selfhood. Embodied selfhood is a perspective that emerged from research that I did with people living with Alzheimer's disease. And what I observed in that work is that despite even severe cognitive impairment, there's a recognizable coherence in how people living with Alzheimer's disease express themselves. I observe this in how they can express social etiquette, affection, how they make friendship overtures, how they have concern for their appearance, and they can engage in religious and artistic practices. Now, this all may seem rather mundane, but it's certainly not when we consider the dominant discourse on Alzheimer's disease that there is an assumed loss of self. That is, the onset and progression of cognitive impairment is likened to a process in which the self is becoming increasingly devoid of content. It's unbecoming a self. And so embodied selfhood presents significant challenge to the assumed loss of self that pervades so much of the literature on dementia. And it does so by disentangling selfhood from the cognitive categories upon which long-standing notions of selfhood are presumed, and foregrounding the pre-reflective ways of being in the world that I argue are so fundamental to selfhood. Now, attention to embodiment in dementia is much, much more than a theoretical exercise. I think it offers an alternative discourse to the pervasive one on pathology, and thus has significant implications for improving care practices. It shifts the focus of care from dysfunction and control to the support of intentional, meaningful, and even creative ways that persons living with dementia can express themselves. And in so doing, care providers are able to attribute meaning to a greater range of actions, thereby broadening the scope and opportunities for the development of interpersonal relationships through communication, and ultimately improving the quality of life and quality of care for individuals living with dementia. So I developed an educational program that was premised on embodied selfhood as a philosophy and approach to dementia care. The impact of practitioners' recognition and support of embodied selfhood was so significant. So just to illustrate this, on a micro level, the recognition of the importance of understanding embodied selfhood looks something like this. A male resident was believed to randomly strike others during meals, actions which were perceived as aggressive and unpredictable. However, once a connection was made between his removing his hat before entering the dining room and then striking others at the table who were wearing a hat, it became clear that his aggressive behavior was related to the etiquette of men removing hats before dining. So a nurse who was enrolled in the program that I developed came to understand that the actions of the resident were actually meaningful expression, and responded by reassigning him to a table where no one wore hats. So here, the significance of this is that no form of restraint was needed, and his expression was actually understood for what it was. Embodied selfhood has also featured prominently in my interest in arts-based approaches to enrich the lives of people living with dementia. And this is because of their creative expressive focus and support of nonverbal communication and affect. The most recent innovation in arts-based approaches to dementia care is elder clowning. Elder clowns are trained artists who use clowning to empower persons living with dementia through opportunities for emotional expression, social interaction, and personal control. They keep their faces very natural with minimal makeup, and they wear clothing that evokes an earlier era, such as 1950s swing dresses. They rely upon information provided by healthcare staff and family members to tailor their interactions to the adult context of the person with dementia. They don a red nose, and they practice physical and verbal humor, fantasy, surprise, dramatic movement, and storytelling. And they utilize improvisation and empathy along with expressive tools such as song, musical instruments, and dance to individualize engagement with residents in long-term care homes. So I led the first nationally funded study to explore the impact of a 12-week elder clowning program in dementia care. The quantitative outcome measures that we used demonstrated a significant decrease in neuropsychiatric symptoms and a significant increase in quality of life. The qualitative findings suggest that interactions were largely founded upon what we've termed relational presence. And this captures the reciprocal nature of clown-resident engagement and the capacity of residents to initiate as well as respond to verbal, embodied, emotive, and creative engagement. Relational presence was achieved and experienced through effective relationality, reciprocal playfulness, and co-constructed imagination. Now, I don't have the time to elaborate on any of these, but I think what's of significance here is that the findings highlight an often overlooked capacity of individuals living with dementia to be deliberately funny, playful, and imaginative, a capacity that must be supported and nurtured in all aspects of institutionalized life, not exclusively through elder clowning, or even specifically, or even arts-based programming more generally. So the social justice implications of this work prompted my engagement with citizenship and human rights discourses, which culminated in the development of a model of citizenship that fully supports the contributions made by individuals living with dementia to social life and what they can expect as citizens in return. It's a model that recognizes that corporeality is a fundamental source of self-expression and is inherently relational in its engagement with the world and with others. So you can see how this model builds on my work on embodied selfhood. The model has already been applied to think about how the citizenship rights of individuals living with dementia in long-term care can be more fully supported. So for example, my postdoctoral fellow, Elisa Grigorovich, who will be participating in the seminar series, together we've drawn in this model to develop a new ethic of sexuality. So by now I think it's obvious that my research focuses on the transformation of the culture of dementia care so that it's more humanistic and quality enhancing. And achieving this is indeed challenging considering the complexity of patient care involves both macro-level influences and micro-level interactions. Understanding point-of-care decisions requires the embodied, reflexive nature of the care activities of practitioners to be contextualized within broader regulatory logics that are governing care. The use of critical social theory and qualitative and arts-based research methods have been essential to how I've explored this complexity. And this culminated in a model that I developed to guide knowledge translation research, which I've called Critical Realism in the Arts Research Utilization Model. It addresses the complexities of practice settings and engaging healthcare practitioners in to critically reflect on existing and proposed practices and strategies for sustaining change. Sociological theories such as critical realism, emotion work, negotiated order, and critical health geography, specifically therapeutic landscape theory, have been additional theoretical sources for exploring the complexities of practice. Literary representations of aging, dementia, and long-term care living have also served as vital sources of ideas about cultural representations of aging, the structures of healthcare, and their influence on individual subjective experience. In addition to understanding the complexities of structure-agency dynamics in healthcare, I think it's really imperative that culture change initiatives make use of approaches that facilitate critical self-reflection. So in the case of my dementia research, by practitioners about how contextual and cultural factors influence and shape their understandings, assumptions, and practices. There is a growing number of qualitative health researchers of diverse disciplinary backgrounds who are experimenting with various forms of performance as an innovative approach to facilitating critical reflection and making research more accessible and relevant in healthcare settings. Drama features prominently in my knowledge translation research, given its interactive, educational, and emancipatory potential. By fostering critical awareness, facilitating understanding, and nurturing empathy, drama-based approaches are well positioned to strengthen initiatives that seek to transform healthcare. So the educational program that I developed, that I mentioned earlier for dementia care practitioners, that was premised on the importance of embodied selfhood, that featured a research-based drama, which was a series of dramatized vignettes that are based on examples of embodied selfhood from the research that I've done in long-term dementia care. Also in the context of dementia, I co-developed a theater production entitled Cracked, New Light on Dementia, that raises questions about the predominant discourse of loss that defines current conceptions of dementia, and the dehumanizing care practices that still prevail in so many care settings. It also inspires alternative ways of relating to persons with dementia, and Julia is going to tell us more about that since she's the theater director and playwright. And if I could just quickly mention that we just received a grant to professionally film the production, so we are thrilled about that, and stay tuned. Do I have just a few more minutes to share some of the teaching I do, or I could skip over it?
We will have to leave at 1.
So should I just skip over that and save it?
I'm okay. Do what you need to do. Yeah.
I'm just saying, we'll have Julia next, but you may have to leave.
Yeah.
So what about if you come back to the, so because some people will need to leave at once, and then the idea is that you can revisit it in the more open time after one. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. Yep. I was just excited to tell you about the Center for Critical Qualitative Health Research, so I'll save that for our discussion if you're interested. So Julie, I'm just getting you set up here. Thank you.
Usually do disappear.
And there you are.
Thank you.
Sorry, Julia,
I'll be quick.
we flipped you there. Marlene has to leave.
No, it's okay. It takes like 45 minutes. They won't be sad not to see me. And I'll be quick. It's okay.
So, Julia Gray will now talk about her work.
Thank you for having me. I'm pretty excited to be here, speaking with these super awesome people. Just saying. I'll just start off, right? I'll just start off by telling you a little bit. Thank you. A little bit about my background. My background is in the arts. My work overlaps the fine arts, the humanities, and the social sciences, and also the health sciences. I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Theater. I've trained as a playwright and as a theater director, and I've worked as a playwright and as a theater director. And I also have a Master's of Arts in Theater Studies, which is an area in the humanities, and then recently completed my PhD in social sciences here at the University of Toronto in education. I'm the artistic director of Possible Arts, which is dedicated to bridging the arts with health research and practice. And I'm a new postdoctoral fellow at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehab Hospital in music and the arts. So my work spans the life course. I'm going to be now moving into working with kids. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. My program of research can generally be divided into two overlapping categories. The first is arts-based knowledge translation and community engagement. And the second area is exploring the ways that people make or engage with arts.
So I'll start off by talking about arts-based knowledge translation and community engagement. And here I'm not approaching, Pia talked a little bit about her model, which I would align myself with. I'm not approaching knowledge translation as a linear act where you have your research findings and then they make their way into professional practice in this very sort of seamless, wonderful way. I'm approaching knowledge translation more as using the arts as a way to open up conversations with community members about misconceptions and injustices in the world. I come from the position that in order to make change or to invite people to do things differently, they and we need to understand why and how we do things a certain way in the first place, as well as why and how those things might be problematic. So the arts, and in my case theater, hold the potential to be a frame to explore experiences, concepts, and ideas, and overturn assumptions. Through this work, I have engaged with theater, film, visual arts, and animation. I've done a number of projects, but I'll just focus on CRACT. It's the most recent project that I've worked on. The full title is CRACT, New Light on Dementia, and I'm the playwright and director. This is a research-informed play, which was collaboratively created with health researchers and artists. We worked regularly with persons with dementia and their family members throughout our process, hearing their stories, and also listening to their feedback on what we were creating. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Our team included health researchers, Dr. Pia Kontos, Dr. Sherry Dupuis, Dr. Gail Mitchell, and Dr. Christine Jonas-Simpson, and actors Susan Applewaite, Lori Nancy Kalamansky, Tim Machin, Mary Ellen McLean, Claire Francis Muir, Mark Prince, and David Talbot. Our intention with CRACT, as Pia mentioned, was to open up conversations about the tragedy discourse of dementia and what this tragedy discourse does to stigmatize persons living with dementia and their families. So why is it that we assume that persons with dementia are simply shells of their former selves rather than persons with agency and possibility? And it's not to say that there are no difficulties with dementia, but why do we assume only loss? What is that about us that moves towards those assumptions? And even more than this, how do these assumptions of only loss inform the way we develop policy, the way we train healthcare providers to work with persons living with dementia, and the way we build and run long-term care homes? These are deeply ingrained assumptions. And our intention with CRACT was to create a space where people might experience dementia differently and begin to see their own assumptions in a new way with the hope of overturning them. So the other area that I'll speak about today is exploring the ways that people make and engage with arts practices. And I'm interested to explore how artistic and scientific processes come together, as well as the ways that people make art and engage with arts practices and what that means for people's lives, how they express themselves, and what that means for people's health more broadly. Through my PhD work, I explored the ways that artist researchers draw on their bodies and imaginations through their creative work, and the ways they do this vulnerably and bravely. And when I'm saying artist researchers, what I mean is those who undertake a scholarly investigation through artistic processes. So how is it that those folks draw on their own bodies and engage their imagination? This study came in response to calls within health and educational qualitative research circles for more theoretically informed and critically threaded approaches to arts-based research broadly and research-informed theater specifically. There's growing acceptance of and interest in arts-based research and growing evidence of the efficacy of arts-based research as forms of knowledge production and translation, but there's little understanding of the art part of arts-based research. In much of the literature and in practice, especially in health, there's an assumption of objectivity, what Trinh Minh Ha and Norman Zenzen would term an aesthetic of objectivity. This perspective assumes that people involved in the art are somehow removed from interpretation. So for example, there's an assumption that the artist is removed from the process, that there's this sort of direct linear process from the research findings into the performance, or that even audience members are removed from interpretation, that the performance has to reach them in such a way that they can kind of take up these little neatly packaged research findings through the performance. And as an artist, this was never really my experience of making art at all. So I became curious about how we might move beyond this aesthetic of objectivity. So I conducted an interpretive case study using CRACT as my case. I drew on a wide range of data. I'm not going to sort of go into all the nitty-gritty, other than to say that there was a lot. And through all of this, I was looking for the ways that artist researchers were placing and drawing on their physical bodies and their embodiment, the ways that they were being imaginative, and the ways they were being vulnerable and brave, or what I've termed foolish. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to launch right ahead to my findings. And what I found is that artist researchers in research-informed theater work within an aesthetic of relationality in response to this aesthetic of objectivity. An aesthetic of relationality can be understood as an aesthetic space where a multiplicity of people, including the artist researchers, the health and social researchers, participants, and audience members, where all of these people are invited to imaginatively and foolishly, or vulnerably and bravely, explore the interrelationship among our bodies, our actions, what we do, and social, cultural, and historical spaces. It's a space where you're not clever. And this was a word one of my participants used, which I thought was really great. The idea is not to be clever. Instead, the aim is to sense what something feels like, to touch people, to be in the present moment, and to work from impulse. It's a space where everyone involved is imaginative and foolish with their bodies, and bodies are understood as physical, emotional, sensory, and situated culturally, socially, and historically. And we do these things so that we might attend to disruptive moments, or what I've termed foolish disruptions. And what I mean by this with foolish disruptions is that things that you once took for granted are vulnerably and bravely experienced in a different way, or seen in a new way. And it's these foolish disruptions that hold the potential to lead to new insights. They don't happen if you're in your head. They don't happen if you're too clever. They have to just happen. And they can't be pointed to. It's not, you can say, look, there's going to be a foolish disruption over here. It's like saying, look, you're going to trip, right? Like the point of saying, look, you're going to trip is so that you don't trip. So you can't, it's a very similar thing. You can't say, check it out, you're going to be disrupted over here. An aesthetic of relationality is a space where, and these are also words from my participants, the words, the actions, the emotions, the way your body moves, the way you hear things, the way you smell things, the way you see things are implicated. Where you might not completely understand someone else's experience, but you can imagine. An aesthetic of relationality provides an important frame to be able to design and plan research-informed theater projects, as well as a frame for evaluation and assessment. So in other words, an aesthetic of relationality provides a frame to better understand rigor and validity for research-informed theater, beyond more traditional scientific expectations of certainty, precision, and control. Through an aesthetic of relationality, I've proposed how we might conceptualize legitimate academic knowledges and practices that produce them to include relational engagement of bodies, imagination, and foolishness. And lastly, I will talk a little bit about my new postdoc position that I just started at Holland Bloorview. And my work is going to follow along similar lines. I'm keen to engage the broader public in conversations about misconceptions about kids living with disabilities through the arts. And I'm also interested to look at the ways that art is made or engaged with in rehab settings, specifically by and with kids living with disabilities. So as an example, I'm interested to explore therapeutic clown in pediatric rehab. There's emerging literature, as Pia talked about, that frames therapeutic clown as relational and aesthetic. This means that therapeutic clown is a form of care that is centered in aesthetics. So it's not centered in function or some other way. It's really all about aesthetics. And it's also an aesthetic practice that's about caring, meaning that it's a form of care that focuses on shape, feel, movement, sensation, and affect. It's a sensory ethical practice grounded in co-created moments where both aesthetic value and caring value are located between people in moments of co-collaboration. So this is not a practice where someone, like a therapist, does something else to someone else, like a client. It's relational. But clowning as an art form, so not therapeutic clown, but clowning as an art form is very disruptive. It's rooted in acts of failure, ridiculousness, and where the clown is in a position of vulnerability. And there's a theoretical gap here when we extend this to therapeutic clown. In what ways are therapeutic clowns disruptive and ridiculous and vulnerable? In what ways are this disruptiveness and vulnerability also what is caring and what is supportive? And does this theoretical depth, understanding therapeutic clown as relational, aesthetic, and disruptive, provide insight into its relevance within pediatric rehab and the lives of children living with disabilities? And that's where I'll end it. There's a little info. Thank you for your time.